Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform in Sri Lanka where we look at the past of the country, an island in the Indian Ocean. We look at the journey the country has taken from then to the present, and also focus on the potential and opportunities for the future. Today our topic of conversation is going to be on taxation and the trajectory of this country in this particular field. We're indeed honoured to have with us someone who is considered a doyen in the field, having contributed immensely over a very long period of time. He has been with KPMG Sri Lanka for over 4 decades, having been a senior partner there. He has chaired the Bank of Ceylon and the Faculty of Taxation. He has also served on many boards in Sri Lanka, and incidentally was also a member of the Presidential Commission on Taxation appointed by President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Our guest today is Mr. Rajan Asirwatham. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time to join us today on the Sri Lankan Understanding. When we talk about taxation in this country and we go back to the past, how was it introduced and why was it deemed necessary at the time?
That's a good question, George. In fact, historical records show that taxation in Sri Lanka started in the 3rd century before Christ, where they imposed a water tax, and then again 2nd century another form of taxation, all on consumption. Then there were also taxes levied on the 2 harbours in Sri Lanka, Mana and Hambantota, where goods were exported. So we have and the system was very well organized. It was a robust system at the time of the Sinhala kings, and taxes were collected effectively, and they were used for public purposes. They ensured that the money that was collected as taxation was utilized for the purpose it was intended to. So it went on well, but in the 1800s, these things were abolished because it caused a lot of problems for people. They couldn't afford the amount of taxation. And you will find that resentment started, and in 1848, during British times, the Matale rebellion led by Gongola Banda, one of the problems was taxation. Because at that time we had a cart tax, a dog tax, a paddy tax, about 6 or 7 different types of taxes, and people revolted against it. That was one of the reasons for that rebellion. And later they had to make amends. But interestingly, George, taxation has also in other countries been the source or the cause of governments failing. Because in the USA, everyone knows that they are the Boston Tea Party, and the cry was no taxation without representation. Mahatma Gandhi started the Indian civil movement with the salt tax. So governments also had that problem. So we had a robust system dating back to the 3rd century BC with records to show that.
It's an amazing journey. I mean, 3rd century. We're not talking about something that happened a few hundred years ago. But how was this perceived by the general public? Most unfortunately, the moment we hear the word taxation, it has a general negative connotation. People get a bit apprehensive. It's looked at not in terms of the productivity that can come out of taxation. How was this perceived by the general public? You talked about the rebellions that have taken place as well. But how were we able to overcome it back then, whether it was in the British period or in the period after independence?
Actually, people of the older generation, as long as they felt it was collected fairly and used for the purpose, I think they paid. Always there's resentment when there's feeling that it's being squandered, and for other purposes. And people, of course, there are others who don't want to pay tax at all, because as you said, taxation is one word people don't want to get involved in, and they always think of income tax, but taxation can take other forms also. But the people, I think, whatever it is, our history records that in the early years, ours were very happy people, who complied. They lived long. They're very disciplined. But with the advent of foreign rule, then the problems arose. And in the 1800s, there were difficulties until the new setup started in the 20th century.
So it was really a case of understanding what it was all about. As you said very correctly, if they felt it was fairly collected and fairly used, and there was some kind of return on the tax through various utilities that were provided through society. We're in conversation with Mr. Rajan Asirwatham, and we're talking about taxation and the trajectory for Sri Lanka. When we come back in the next segment, we're going to focus on some of the challenges in the present context, how this process evolved from independence onwards, and also how we are trying to convert those challenges into opportunities. When we return with the next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We are in conversation with Mr. Rajan Asirwatham, and we are focusing on taxation and the trajectory of Sri Lanka. Before we went to the break, we looked at the journey in the past, independence, as you rightly mentioned, from the 3rd century onwards, and the periods of colonialism, rebellion against it, and how things were changed in the 1800s. From independence onwards, various taxation laws have come in. How has this been implemented over the last 7 decades?
Yeah, actually, modern laws came in before independence. The first Inland Revenue Act, or the ordinance, was Act number 2 of 1932. And that's the time the Income Tax Department was set up by the British. And it became effective from 1st April 1932, where they set out an ordinance how to collect taxes. It was generally because at that time the tea, rubber and coconuts were doing well, products, plus income landowners. It was a well thought out ordinance. Of course, the number of taxpayers would have been small because it was, a lot of it was that the economy depended on the British. They controlled the economy, and the taxes was fairly straightforward. Then thereafter, there have been income tax acts coming in after independence in 49, 63, 70, 76, like that. But the basis of the modern taxation is the ordinance of 1932, which was when the Income Tax Department was set up. And our present regime follows that form historically. So historically, we can think of modern taxation as almost about 89 years now in the country.
So it's the same policy that we have continued, or has there been consistency throughout?
Of course, you have got to evolve with time. So therefore, there have to be changes. But I think the problem is the inconsistency. One of the facts is that we have had over the years a plethora of taxes. We have income tax, wealth tax, estate duty, capital gains tax, so many different indirect taxes, and it was decided at one stage that it's better to simplify the system. As far as the laws are concerned, naturally you have to offer incentives. But the complaint of taxpayers is that sometimes the department offers an incentive, and when you utilize it, and they find that the tax revenue has come down, they change the law. I agree that you can't have, over the years, with modern concepts, things have changed, and new ideas have to come in. But the basic principles, and there should be consistency where at least you must give a guarantee. At least 5 years, this law will not be changed. Unfortunately, because we have changes of government here, what one government does, the other one comes and changes. So the taxpayer is caught in between. And it's also true because it's more so when we are trying to attract foreign investments. They are upset when there's no consistency. They come into the country on the basis of the law that was prevalent at that time, but then they find that no, now it's different, it's changed, and it has to be. So that is, there has to be some sort of constitutional guarantee that unless there is something unusual, that there will be something will be there for a few years at least, say 5 years or 3 years, so that people could plan. Now, obviously, with the pandemic and things, there are new ideas, things have to come in. But if you tell an investor, you will have tax relief if you do this, and you're guaranteed for 5 years, okay, but he makes his plans and comes in. But if by the time he has come in, you say, no, now the law has changed, you don't get the relief, then he gets upset and he goes elsewhere. So
this is a very big problem, not only from a citizen perspective of individuals, and as you mentioned earlier on, when you implement a policy, if you feel it's not earning enough revenue, you change the policy. Now, that's not very long-sighted. Strategizing has failed at that point. But also from an investor perspective, international community is very concerned. If they come in under one regime and they continue, they're going to face another problem later on. That's going to affect their internal strategizing. So this is a huge problem, certainly within this field. But how is that being overcome, and how has it been overcome up to date? We've had so many changes. You mentioned how it changes sometimes from regime to regime, but we've still complied, or have we complied?
The short answer is no.
This is a huge problem. This is a huge problem that we are facing.
It has got more acute.
I guess it's also because people take time to understand that process, understand that policy. Is there enough awareness being built around it? Promotion of why taxation is important, or a particular tax is important? Has that been done in the past?
Well, it's in a small way now. Sometimes you drive around Colombo, you will find a board saying your taxes are contributing to this road being widened. It's more psychological. They say, because you paid your tax on time, we're able to do this. But there is general skepticism because of the shortfall, and the inconsistency is a problem that has got worse. But I don't think there's much planning and thinking going into changing things overnight, and that is a real problem.
That's a very dangerous thing in terms of how you feel there is a shortfall and then decide of having a new policy from the next month or the next year, where people have not been made aware of it and they're not complying with it. And so this is certainly a huge challenge there. When we return with our next segment, we're going to be focusing on where taxation is going, why taxation is necessary, how it is being done elsewhere, and the potential for Sri Lanka as we look at the trajectory into the future. We are in conversation with Mr. Rajan Asirwatham, when we return with the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We are in conversation with Mr. Rajan Asirwatham, and we're talking about taxation and the trajectory of Sri Lanka. When we look at different forms of taxation, direct or indirect taxes, which have been applied in Sri Lanka, how successful have we been in these two particular areas?
If you look at the central bank report for 2019, it states that the proportion, the percentage is 75-25. 75 indirect and 25 direct. It's an improvement from 80-20. But there are experts who think that the ideal is 60-40, that you should get more. When we we're talking of the consistency. Now, just to give an example, we have got used to PAYE, that is pay as you earn from your salary. Now, the limit today in Sri Lanka is 3 million rupees. So, if you earn over that, your employer deducts the tax. You don't feel it, remits the department, and you're okay. And there is a withholding tax on interest on rent payments. In 2020, for some unaccountable reason, the government said no more no more PAYE, no more withholding tax. So your income you draw, unless you tell the employer to deduct, he won't deduct. Then on interest and things, unless you tell the bank to deduct, they won't deduct. So there will be a large number of people who will be quite happy. And earlier, now when we were on the Taxation Commission, we found that is a very effective way to collect it at source. Because if you tell a person who's paying rent, deduct so much withholding tax, that's sent to you, department. The collection from interest sent to the department. Now that has come down because some people are lazy, some people say, why should I? And then you are supposed to ask them to deduct and open a file. When you have a number of files, that causes more problems for the department. It's much easier to have income tax files for the people whose income is over a certain amount, and for people whose income is from employment or from things like interest, have withholding tax. It's painless, and they're also happy. Because that is so the change in the law, no one can understand why it was done. because it means that less revenue is collected, and people are also, in their heart of hearts, sometimes they feel, should I ask them to deduct PAYE? I say, no, if they don't want to, I will pay. No, never mind, I'll pay on my own, and then they don't have the funds at that time. So this question of get from the source is doing away with it is not very satisfactory. Then I must also say, George, that one of the problems in Sri Lanka is the great deal of evasion of taxation. People, if they have the slightest chance, they do not pay their taxes. It's true the world over, because we read in the papers and said that the USA, some of the wealthiest people are paying very little taxes. They're getting away with it. Then there are other ways of getting away with it, because all countries have a residence rule. That is, if you owe 180 days in the country, you pay on your world income. So that's why the very rich people move around. Some people live on yachts, but they are not in any country, because they are not liable. Of course, if you are a US citizen, it's world income. But evasion, Sri Lanka, I think evasion is very great. And there are various reasons for it. One is that it's a natural tendency of people to, get one over the system, or not to pay what is due from you. There are others who, when you talk to them, they give you some reasons which sound sometimes amusing. Why don't you open a tax file? No, I have been told that if I open a tax file, they'll keep on harassing me, asking queries, and better not to, I will give it to charity. Then someone say, I don't want to pay tax because these politicians, they are importing cars and they are flying on. Well, why should I pay money for them? That's an excuse. Then others say, no, I will pay to the state in other forms, but I don't want to get involved in this. So the evasion is very great in Sri Lanka, and if that can be solved by positive education, that will help. There should be some guarantee that, like the past law had it, that if you send your return in time and pay the taxes on time, that no queries can be raised after a certain period of time. Now we have a thing called the where time bar of assessment, and that time bar has been reduced. But so you send your return in, assessor finds that the time bar period is coming in, he sends an estimated assessment. So time bar doesn't apply. So there is no finality to this. So we say, why should we get involved? Because they are not giving us they won't give you a letter saying, yes, your taxes are final unless a taxation certificate. So what is the point in going on like this? So so people are averse to open it, but if they feel that the money is for a particular purpose, I'm sure they will. Now, if the Inland say, from your taxes, 20% is gone for the health budget, 10% for the education budget, people will think, yes. And if that is followed, there'll be a great incentive to pay.
That's why you have ownership of things that are being provided by the state. As you mentioned, education, healthcare, you feel that you have contributed towards making it a better system, or at least improving it to some extent. It may not be the best, but at least you are a stakeholder in it. I guess that is where we need to bring people involved. So you've been involved from both sides, I feel, from a formulator's perspective and from an implementer's perspective. You've looked at it from a presidential commission point of view, but also whether it be with KPMG or whether it be with the Faculty of Taxation. Going into the future, how are we going to overcome this? You said we need to make people more aware. We need to increase this understanding of civic consciousness. I am a citizen. What do I owe my country? What am I going to do for my country? How am I going to contribute? Other countries have very strict policies. In the United States, for example, it is a very, very strict policy of how they tax. But of course, as you mentioned, there are evaders. I guess that is there around the world. How do we take Sri Lanka from looking at taxation from a negative perspective into that understanding of I am a stakeholder, whether I as an individual, I as the head of an organization? How do we change that mindset? That attitude has to change. How are we going to do that?
Yeah, that is the thing that worries us also, that people have sort of a negative impact. The moment you mention the word taxation, they throw up their hands in horror. That education is not there. But also, George, we have to look at the question of tax evasion. Now, there is a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion.
Okay.
Tax avoidance is something legitimate and should not upset anybody because you're making use of even a loophole in the law. Evasion is something to be condemned. But people, there is no social stigma about tax evasion. Now,
that's the main problem, probably.
Yeah.
That lack of a social, it's not considered to be something bad. It's like, I've beaten the system, as you mentioned earlier.
Because if somebody were to ask you, you must be paying heavy tax. But nonsense, I don't have a tax file even. Quite happy to say that. And go away. Quite happy to say that, I've beaten the system. While they say, no, you can avoid tax in a legitimate way because there are incentives. You can pay less tax. And no one should grumble on. So you have to plan your taxes and pay to the state is legitimate due. But feel shy to talk of evasion.
This is not something that should be considered a triumph or something great that you have achieved in terms of avoiding tax. Because, and as you mentioned, that lack of social stigma, that lack of civic consciousness. We don't feel that we need to be doing a lot more as citizens. We are benefiting from the system. We live in the country. We enjoy benefits within the country. It might not be everything that we want. It might not be utopian the way we idealistically dream it to be. But we do have a lot, and that is where we really need to become, and that's that patriotism comes in there, in terms of understanding taxation. But as you said, there's a negative connotation that has to be overcome. Consistency in policy is very necessary in terms of taking this forward, looking at taxation from a new prism, a new angle, adopting a new attitude. So,
actually, also there is no recognition of taxpayers. A few years back, they had a good scheme that if you paid over a certain amount of money, 1 million rupees in taxes, and you paid it on the due date, they gave you a gold card, like these gold cards. It didn't have much, it a monetary value. But the fact that you had a gold card means the department, or they give you a silver card, you paid a low amount. You didn't get any penny, but the fact that you had a gold card made you feel, yes, they are recognizing me. I remember at one time, in the airport, there was a separate counter, you could go, but that's all, there was no cash outflow. So you ask your friend, are you paying tax? Yes, when I pay. So you have a gold card or silver card, now you can't ask them, I know your level of income, and if you're having a gold card, that it's a small amount, then something is wrong with you. At least they must feel that if that a person over at a certain level or certain amount must have some recognition within revenue that we have recognized that he has paid his taxes the correct amount on the due date as required by the law, and we are recognizing him. We are not giving him a rebate or anything. But that was thrown out. So no one knows whether you are paying tax, whether you are not paying tax.
We need an overhauling of the entire system, I feel. I mean, there needs to be a lot more scrutiny of this sector because it is the key income generator. I mean, this is something very important for the country in terms of looking at the finances for the future, how we are going to address all of these areas. And as you said, giving people little incentives like that. I mean, it's not a big deal to give people a queue at the airport. It makes them feel that they have achieved something. And that's where we're going to create that social stigma. If you haven't paid your tax, now there's something wrong. Not that if you have been able to avoid it. So that's a very vital area. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for discussing this area and focusing on this area. You have contributed to this field over the last several decades in terms of how we have been able to evolve the system. But of course, there is policy that is formulated at a much higher level. And at the end of the day, it has to be implemented. So one of the main areas that we need to understand is the need for consistency in this particular sector. How are we going to ensure consistency? This is a democracy. Governments come and governments go. But policies have to remain. People have to be understanding of their civic consciousness and what we are contributing. How do we promote patriotism? Not look at it from a prism of a political understanding of how we are supportive or not supportive of a regime that comes into power. It has to be the country that has to be focused on at the end of the day. In conversation today was Mr. Rajan Asirwatham, and we talked about taxation and the trajectory of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time when we focus on another area where we look at the evolution process in Sri Lanka, how it was in the past, where we are at present. and the potential for the future.